Back in 1836 in Sydney, Australia, something happened that would change everything. Major Thomas Livingston Mitchell set out as Surveyor General with instruments, notebooks, and a mandate, map the unknown, find routes for settlement, and report on land that might feed a growing colony. What he found, after weeks of trudging across sun-baked plains and river gums, was a country startlingly different from the scrub and salt bush the colonists feared. Rolling grasslands, broad rivers, and rich soil unfurled before his party. He called it Australia Felix, fortunate or happy Australia, and his dispatches read like a proclamation. Mitchell's account arrived in Sydney and then in London with the force of revelation. For officials and for wealthy squatters hungry for grazing land, his descriptions were not neutral geography, they were permission. Within months, squatters were swarming the Port Phillip district, dragging sheep and cattle into territory that had been home to Aboriginal clans for generations. The drama that followed was textbook colonial acceleration, policy, profit, and paper. Mitchell's maps and reports became instruments of settlement policy. Land that had been lived in and managed by indigenous peoples was reclassified on a map and then sold, leased, or simply occupied. The pastoral economy took root, fences went up, and with them came conflict. But here the story twists from discovery into a darker pattern, a conspiracy not of a single cabal, but of a system, a conspiracy of silence and of convenience. Mitchell's glowing portrait of Australia's riches suited the interests of the colonial administration and the pastoral elite. To keep settlers coming and capital flowing, uncomfortable truths were minimized. Reports of Aboriginal resistance, of reprisals and massacres in the wake of occupation, were patchy, delayed, or buried. Newspapers, official dispatches, and private letters often softened or obscured the violence. In some cases, troopers and settlers carried out punitive expeditions. In many others, indigenous deaths and displacements were never properly recorded. Mitchell himself is a complicated figure in this tableau. A professional soldier and meticulous surveyor, he believed in the imperial mission of mapping and improvement. His journals brimmed with scientific observation and an almost evangelical confidence in colonial progress. Yet his work, whatever his personal intent, provided the narrative and the evidence that made dispossession administratively simple and politically palatable. He named landscapes, measured rivers, and in doing so converted living country into cadastral opportunities. The tension between discovery and dispossession is the real subject of this story. The conspiracy is revealed in choices, what was written down and celebrated and what was left out, which eyewitness accounts were amplified and which were ignored. Those omissions mattered. They allowed a rush of settlement to proceed with minimal scrutiny, even as Aboriginal communities were pushed off their food sources, hunted from their own lands, and forced into violent defensive encounters. The immediate consequences were devastating. Across western Victoria and the surrounding plains, the arrival of flocks and fences triggered frontier wars, broken kinship networks, and a collapse of indigenous authority in places. Over decades, the demographic and cultural impacts were catastrophic. Mitchell's celebrated Australia Felix became for many a memory of loss. Today, the maps and journals survive as complex artifacts. Historians and indigenous scholars have revisited Mitchell's records, and the names he gave the land are now read beside the names that existed long before his compass pointed north. The story forces a reckoning. Discovery is not only a moment of revelation, but a decision about what to see and what to hide. Understanding how those choices enabled dispossession helps explain why the effects of 1836 are still with us in land claims, place names, and the ongoing work of truth-telling. This is not a tale of a single villain, but of a colonial machinery that turned exploration into entitlement. Major Mitchell's Australia Felix remains one of the most consequential discoveries in Australian history, a landscape of promise for some and a witness to loss for many more.